So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings. So we're looking at Geeta Hariharan's short story, Remains of the Feast. This will be the concluding lecture for this particular text. So we've seen how in the lecture before this, we saw how that the protagonist in the story, Rukmini, had been hospitalized. And obviously her cancer has been accentuated to a certain extent, perhaps, by her consumption of outside food. Food from the bazaar, from the local bazaar, food which are made by, in very unhygienic conditions. And we saw how the act of consuming that kind of food becomes, in a way, a resistance towards the cancer that was consuming her body. So there's a bit of an auto-consumptive activity that happened through this act of consumption, where she kept consuming Coca-Cola, samosas, bhel puri, and all of the kinds of food from the bazaar. So we're told, we've now given a description of what happened when she died and the speciality around her death. The day she died, she kept searching the room with her eyes. Her arms were held down by the tubes and needles, cross, in and out. So, she's surrounded by needles and tubes. So her entire body becomes, enveloped in a way by all these medical machines. And again, one can connect this to silver plus tulips, where too a similar thing happens. The female body is sort of contained and consumed by the medical machines, which scan and gaze at her. The glucose dripped into her veins, but her nose still ran, the clear, thin liquid trickling down like a dribble onto her chin. Her hands clenched and unclenched with the effort, and she whispered, like a miracle, "Ratna." My mother and I rushed to the bedside. Tears streaming down her face, my mother bent her head before her and pleaded, "Give me your blessings, Pati. Bless me before you go." So the mother, Ratna's mother, goes to this very old woman and requests her for her blessings before she goes. So there's a bit of a sacred ritual, that religious ritual that is sanctioned within a Brahmin household. But then we're told that we very quickly see what she does, what Rukmini does over here, which is completely different from anything sacred, completely different from anything which is religious, completely different from anything which is moral. And her final act of subversion becomes a real act of subversion. It becomes a bodily act of subversion, which is a continuation, an extension of the subversion that was happening through consuming different kinds of food. So that was something which we see over here. My great-grandmother looked at her for a minute, her lips working furiously, noiselessly. For the first time in my life, I saw a fine veil of perspiration on her face. So again, very, very visceral, the perspiration, the beds of sweat appearing on her face. The muscles on her face twitched in mad, frenzied jerks. Then she pulled one arm free of the tubes in a sudden crazy spurt of strength, and the ivy pole crashed to the floor. Right? So this becomes obviously a very iconic act of subversion, where she crashes the medical machines around her. When one last show of strength, one last show of bodily subversion, where she summons the strength, whatever remains in her body, in a dying body, and she pulls and jerks the ivy pole to the point that it crashes on the floor. "Bring me a red sari," she screamed, "a red one with a big white border of gold, and," her voice cracked, "bring me peanuts with chili powder from the corner shop, onion and green chili bonders deep fried in oil." So the red sari over here obviously becomes a very subversive sartorial signifier over here, because she's a Brahmin widow, and for the last part of her life she had worn white sari because of her widowhood. And this last desire to wear a red sari, of course, red over here becomes, the woman, the symbol of femininity, in the sense that it becomes the color of menstruation. So she wants to go back to be the menstruating woman again. And that, of course, becomes a very deep and sort of strong articulation of feminine agency over here. The desire to become the menstruating woman, the desire to become the sexualized woman. So red obviously becomes the image, the color of sexualization, menstruation, and that becomes that in a way it connects to a degree of female agency, which is obviously she wants to hold on to, she wants to articulate with all the intensity, with all the strength. "Bring me a red sari," she screamed, "a red one with a big white border of gold." So again, the colors are very, very important. The colors are very sexualized over here. And of course, she wants food, which is very, very sexualized in quality as well. She bring me peanuts with chili powder from the corner shop, onion and green chili bonders deep fried in oil. So all this desire for food, a desire for color, becomes part of the erotic quality of subversion that we've been seeing since the very beginning of the story, where she begins to consume cakes with egg, when she begins to consume different kinds of aerated drinks, when she begins to consume brandy in different forms. So that this becomes, this last desire, this last articulation of desire becomes the last bit of narrative of subversion that she is enacting over here. Then the voice gurgled and gurgled, her face and neck swayed, rocked like a boat lost in a stormy sea. She retched, and as the vomit flew out of her mouth, her nose thick like milkshakes she had drunk, brown like an alcoholic coke, her head slumped forward, her rounded chin buried in a cancerous neck. So the final act, even when she died, the final act of dying becomes one with movement, becomes one of bodily movement and a bodily, function. So that becomes, in a way, a very symbolic subversion in the end. So she doesn't die quietly, she doesn't die peacefully, she doesn't die with grace, she doesn't die by blessing the daughter-in-law, the great daughter-in-law, the granddaughter-in-law, but she dies desiring for sexualized dress, she dies desiring for erotic food, she dies desiring for an act of subversion. So that last desire becomes very, very important, and that becomes a very important issue in terms of articulation of female agency, particularly in this kind of a masculinist medical space where she's sort of surrounded and imprisoned by needles and tubes all around her. But the last act of toppling that over, the last act of crashing the ivy pole to the ground becomes, in a way, a symbolic act of subversion, which is something which is quite scenic in quality and spectacular in quality. So if you look at the final act of subversion, which is very spectacular, you can contrast that with the more clandestine quality of subversion which happened in midnight in a little room where the great-granddaughter would smuggle in food for her and she would eat those secretly in a small room in a house. But over here, the final act of subversion happens in almost a public space, the medical space, under the public gaze, and it becomes spectacular, it becomes iconic in quality, it has a larger-than-life quality to it. When it brought the body home, and I'm not yet a doctor and already I can call her that, I helped my mother to wipe her clean with a wet, soft cloth. She wiped away the smells, the smell of the hospital bed, the smell of an old woman's juices drying. Her skin was dry and papery, the stubble on her head. She had refused to shave her head once she got sick, had grown like the soft white bristles of a hairbrush. So again, the refusal to shave her head becomes an act of subversion, becomes an act of resistance towards cancer to a large extent. She had had only one child, though she had lived so long, but the skin on her stomach was like crumpled frayed velvet, the creases running to and fro in fine, silvery rivulets. "Bring her sari," my mother whispered, as if my great-grandmother could still hear her. I looked at the stiff, cold body that I was seeing naked for the first time. She was asleep at last, quite at last. I had learned in the last month or two to expect the unexpected from her. I waited in case she changed her mind and sat up, remembering one more table food to be tasted. So it begins to take an uncanny quality now. The great-granddaughter, Ratna, almost hopes, almost expects her to get up, and the dead great-grandmother to get up and ask for one last forbidden food, one last table food, because she had expected, she began to expect the unexpected from her over the last couple of months. So she wants to remember. I mean, she can almost visualize her getting up from the cop's position and demanding one more forbidden food, one more table food. "Bring me your eyebrow tweezers," I heard her say. "Bring me the hair-removing cream. I have a mustache and I don't want to be an ugly old woman." So, she can still hear the voices in her head. Her great-grandmother telling her to bring the eyebrow tweezers, bring the hair-removing cream. She doesn't want to be an ugly woman. She wants to be a beautiful woman, and she wants to be a desired woman. So all these voices are running in her head, the great-granddaughter's head. And this becomes a beautiful story about viscerality, as you can see. It's a moving story, a moving account about viscerality and female agency, particularly as it negotiates with the discursive apparatus of the medical space, the home space, the household space, etc. But she lay still, the wads of cotton in her nostrils and ears shutting out her belated ardor. I ran to my cupboard and brought her the brightest, reddest sari I could find, last year's Diwali sari, my first silk. So, this becomes very, very symbolic in quality. I unfolded it, ignoring my mother's eyes, which were turning aghast. I covered her naked body lovingly. The red silk glittered like her childish laughter. So redness, obviously the red sari is, as I mentioned, it can symbolically be seen as a sartorial signifier of womanhood, a sexualized womanhood, someone about to become a woman. So we are told that the great-granddaughter had received her first silk sari. She's about to become a woman, the first Diwali gift. And that is sari which is given to the dead body, on the dead body of the great-grandmother. And of course, that makes a connect between these two figures, between these two liminal figures, complete. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, perhaps in the last lecture, that is a liminality which informs the identities of these two people. So, we have this great grandmother who is this very old woman, but who wants to be back to being a desired woman, who wants to be back being a desired girl. And there's this transition happening in the body, in the mind. And of course, we have the more metabolic, more biological, more natural transition happening with the great-granddaughter, Ratna. And also two names are sort of, phonically similar to each other, Ratna, Rukmini. And Ratna, of course, is a woman, is a girl who is sort of growing up to be a woman, who is on a cusp of womanhood, and she's received a first red sari, and that first red sari, which is a symbol of womanhood, the menstruating woman, the sexualized woman, that is now given to the dead body of the great grandmother, and that becomes the final act of subversion, to a sartorial signifier, a sort of very spectacular sartorial signifier, the redness, the glittering color of the particular sari. And of course, the mother's eyes become aghast, were turning aghast. And she says, "Have you gone mad?" My mother whispered furiously. She was a sick old woman, and she didn't know what she was saying. She rolled up the sari and flung it aside, as if it had been polluted. She wiped the body again to free it from foolish, trivial desires. So again, the final act of pollution becomes the final act of subversion. So this equation between pollution and subversion is something which runs throughout the story in a brilliant way, actually. It's one of the finest short stories that one can read about the whole act of contamination being an act of subversion. So desire to be contaminated, desire to be sexually contaminated, desire to be gastronomically contaminated. All these desires become little micro desires, little micro acts of subversion from within a household space. So these don't become massive public acts of subversion, but these become little acts of subversion, which mean a lot experientially, which mean a lot existentially, especially in the cultural setting of this particular household. So she wiped the body again to free it from foolish, trivial desires. They burned her in a pale brown sari, her widow's weeds, the prayer beds I have never seen her touch, encircling the bulging, obscene neck. So the prayer beds, the holy Hindu prayer beds come back, and she's dressed up as this holy Hindu Brahmin. But before that, the final act of subversion had happened. She had been donned, she had been given the glittering red sari. The first silk sari of her great-granddaughter had been given to her. So in that sense, she had become sexualized again. The final act, the final desire to be desired, that has come back to her. And whatever happens after that, the pale brown sari, the widow's weeds, the prayer beds, which we are told, by the way, that she never used. The great-granddaughter has never seen her use those. Those are given to her in a very ceremonious, ritualistic fashion, which don't mean anything at all at this point of time. So we see an act of experiential, existential subversion, which far exceeds any kind of ritual over here. And therein lies the power of this particular story. Therein lies the impact of this particular story in terms of discursive quality it attains through experiential processes. I'm still a novice at anatomy. I hover just over the body. I'm just beneath the skin. I have yet to look at the insides. The entrails of memories she told me nothing about. The pain congealing into a cancer. So again, she has, we're told that she's trained to be a doctor, but she's not really a full doctor yet. As a result of which, she still has the experiential, existential gaze, not a fully reified medical gaze. She hasn't been hardened by the medical gaze yet. She hasn't been hardened by the reified medical gaze yet. So she still has the purity, the human quality, the organic quality of the human gaze with which she sees the grandmother, the great-grandmother. She has left me behind with nothing but a smell, a legacy that grows fainter every day. I hunt the dirtiest bakeries and tea stalls I can find every evening. I search for her, my sweet great-grandmother, in plate after plate of stale confections and needle-sharp green chilies, deep-fried and rancid oil. I plot her revenge for her. I give myself diarrhea for a week. So again, this becomes a very visceral act of retaliation. So this is her plotting a revenge for her. This is the great-granddaughter avenging the great-grandmother by having diarrhea, by having contaminated food. So the whole act of willfully having contaminated food, the whole act of willfully having stale food, the whole act of willfully having impure food becomes an act of retaliation. It's something you do to your body, which then becomes a statement against the moral parameters which constrict you as a woman. So the fact that you're giving yourself diarrhea, in a way, becomes an agentic activity. So diarrhea over here is a very symbolic agentic activity. for this particular in this particular context. So we find again, what you do to your body willfully, agentically, becomes a very important activity over here, especially in relation to the different discursive imprisonments that you're subjected to as a subject, as a female subject in this particular setting. Then I open all the windows and a cupboard and air the rooms. I tear her dirty grey saris to shreds. I line the shelves of her empty cupboard with my thick, newly bought, glossy, jacketed texts, one next to the other. They stand straight and solid, row after row of armed soldiers. They fill up the small cupboard in minutes, right? So we find that the final scene of this particular book, this particular story, is how the great-granddaughter emptying out her cupboards of the great-grandmother and filling those cupboards with thickly, newly bought, glossy, jacketed medical books, presumably medical texts, to stand straight and solid, row after row of armed soldiers. So this becomes almost a scene of agency, an architecture of agency, as it were. So she's not about to become a doctor, she's about to acquire medical knowledge through these texts. And, and that becomes a scene, that becomes an apparatus, that becomes an architecture of an agentic, of an appropriated agency over here, to fill up the small cupboard in minutes. So the whole room is reconfigured, the whole space is reconfigured. So what we find over here is a reconfiguration of space. And again, that is very, very discursive in quality. The fact that she's bought all these medical books, this very thick, heavily jacketed, newly bought, glossy jacketed medical books, and are made to stand in cupboards row after row like soldiers. And again, armed soldiers become important over here, because armed soldiers, obviously, possessing armed soldiers becomes a symbolic act of acquiring agency. So she gives us a diarrhea. This is a revenge. That's a revenge against what she saw happen to her great-grandmother. That's the way she avenged her great-grandmother's lack of agency by going to the dirtiest, most contaminated, the most impure stalls in the bazaar and subjecting herself to all kinds of fried food to the point that she gives herself diarrhea. Diarrhea becomes an agentic act over here, something she does to her body. And subsequent to that, she comes back home, empties the cupboards, and fills the cupboards with newly bought medical textbooks that become an extension of agency, a more permanent marker of agency. We obviously assume that she's about to become a doctor, she's about to become an agentic woman with knowledge, with economic stability, with economic agency, someone who can make her own decisions. So that certainty in the end, that act of certainty in the end, which begins to brew from the point where she decides to go and give her red silk sari, her first woman's sari, to the great-grandmother, that begins to become the narrative of certainty with which the story ends. And the last scene is a scene of certainty. We have books after books, like a row of armed soldiers, and they stand together, as some kind of a regiment, a gallery of little markers of agency, which she'll acquire as a female, which she'll acquire as a medical student, with which she'll grow as a woman. And in that sense, that will be a continuation of her avenging her great-grandmother, which began by her going to the bazaar and consuming contaminated food. So with that, we conclude this particular story, Remains of the Feast, which also happens to be the final text for this particular course. We'll have a series of lectures from now on with, conceptual summing up of all the texts we've done so far, and also we look at a blend of the theoretical study and a textual study we have done in this course so far. But that'll be more of a concluding session or concluding sessions in the next few lectures. But this happens to be the final text that we cover in this particular course, Feminist Writings. So I'll see you in the next lecture, where we have a conceptual discussion of what we covered so far. Thank you for your attention.